Hello students, I hope you survived that little surprise exam on the Kingdom of Basilia. Such tests are necessary as we want to ensure only the best and brightest guide the future of Mantica. Now then, as you all prepare yourselves for the coming day, let me speak of another of the races of Mantica. Let me speak of the Dwarves. Now before I start, I need to say that getting any information out of a dwarf is like pulling out a dragon's tooth. Still, after centuries of research, much has been gleaned about the nature of dwarves, and the best way to start having an understanding of the dwarf is through their creation myth. When the gods that existed before the arrival of the Celestians were crafting the other races, the god who would be known as the mother of the dwarves wept in the depths of the earth. She could not bear children, and thus could not know the joy of creating life. Because of this, she was struck with a great sadness and wept alone in the darkness. At some point, her tears splashed against a few of the stalagmites that dotted the large cavern, and those stalagmites soon breathed with life. Looking in wonder at her accidental creation, the goddess molded the now breathing stone into a new form, a form ideal for life beneath the surface. A race that would be known from then on as the Dwarves. From this myth, you can glean much of the Dwarven belief and mindset. They believe themselves to be the masters of the underground world, and that everything of worth is crafted with one's own hands, not to mention being as stubborn and unchanging as the rock they were born from. And it is perhaps because they were a race born of stone that the Dwarves are so literal-minded. Everything they do has a point and a purpose, and adding any stylish flair that would distract from that purpose is seen as a waste. The perfect example of this is their poetry, where things like simile and metaphor might as well be a foreign language. The most famous dwarven poems read like journal entries describing a dwarf's day. Although the dwarves seem to be a folk without much room for mirth or hobbies, there is one activity they take great pleasure in: smoking. It is said that a dwarf who doesn't smoke must be a bit off, and it isn't uncommon to see a dwarf smoke every chance he or she can, scoffing at the weaker constitutions of other races who don't appreciate the wonders of tobacco and the differing flavors of weed. Some would say that dwarves were built for war. Their short, stocky, muscular frames are extremely tough, and their low center of gravity makes them hard to bowl over. Place them in heavy armor, and they essentially become living fortresses, immovable mountains of metal ready to take anything the world throws at them. Axes and hammers showcase their workmanlike attitude towards war, and their tactics and strategies, although artless and blunt, are reliable and have proven true against many different enemies across many centuries. Ironclads are the immovable core of a dwarven army, ready to lure enemies into the attack. And when the enemies find themselves stuck against their immovable forms, the dwarves attack in an unhurried and businesslike manner. The strongest of these ironclads, known as shield breakers, wield heavy two-handed hammers and break down more stubborn enemy defenses. And when the enemy tries to use the speed of their mounts to their advantage, stoic bullwalkers armed with long spears and thick armor are there to halt them dead. Besides melee combat, dwarves were also the first race to craft the gun, and it's a weapon that fits the dwarves perfectly. Loud, dirty, and brutal, there is no art to the black powder spewing weapons, just a singular purpose that it fulfills diligently. Older dwarves who might be weaker in body but still keen in mind may choose to become part of the Iron Watch, an organized wall of rifles ready to lay a wall of bullets on the enemy. The dwarven warsmiths are always innovating the designs of the gun. Rifled barrels, shaped charges, and other more bizarre innovations are always being developed. And each new innovation is always tested on the battlefield by placing it in the hands of the warsmith apprentices. The young dwarven sharpshooters taking out important targets through scopes while constantly taking notes on the gun's recent modifications. And when regular guns aren't enough, iron belchers and heavy bore cannons lay torrents of fire on less technologically advanced foes. Each dwarven hold has a claim on some form of dwarven industry: mining, brewing, stonemasonry, but the warsmiths are in control of all aspects of dwarven life that has to do with war. Not officially part of any clan, the warsmiths are more of a monastic order than engineering clan, formed into guilds, called chambers. Each chamber focuses on one aspect of war, from something as specific as the honing of an axe blade, to something as cryptic as the interrelations of cogs. And each of these chambers is centered around a white eternal flame, dedicated to the shining one known as Fulgria, goddess of the white fire. Dwarves, as a rule, are rather uncomfortable around religion, and the dedication of the warsmiths to a shining one is seen as rather undwarf-like. But with the warsmiths being so necessary, such worship tends to be ignored. To become a warsmith is to forsake all ties to your old life and clan, dedicating yourself to learning the deep secrets of engineering. A young warsmith will first choose a chamber to learn from. Once he or she has learned all they can choose to stay and teach other dwarves as a master, or move on to new chambers to learn from them. Those who dedicate their lives to studying from the hundreds of differing chambers are known as Ungwer, or journeyman in the common tongue, and are said to be the most creative of all warsmiths, introducing new innovations and improvements into the dwarven war machine and occasionally forming new chambers of their own. Many are the weapons crafted by this order, from common melee weapons and firearms to more exotic weaponry. Some dedicated warsmiths can craft weapons that can cast holy white fire, known as fire priests. And the mining guilds are known to use their mining tools in battle to become battle drillers. But one of the most destructive weapons in the warsmith arsenal is the steel behemoth, a massive armor-plated war machine which spews fire as fast as water flows in a river. When a human suffers an extreme form of emotional duress, the healthiest thing for them to do generally is to perhaps talk about their feelings and slowly heal over time. The dwarven mindset makes such openness impossible, and thus they have a different method to overcome such emotional obstacles: the Red Curse. Whether it was a broken heart, the loss of one's skill due to injury or age, or the shame of exile, the dwarf's sadness may form into a little kernel of rage within them that when released in the battlefield becomes a torrent of bladed fury. Some of them are even crazy enough to ride the vicious creatures known as Brocks. Think of them as a species of honey badger, but just much bigger. I was also going to say meaner, but I believe when it comes to honey badgers that might be impossible. Dwarves who master the Red Curse wield magical war axes as symbols of their skill, and are quite renowned across dwarven society. Those who succumb to the rage become addicted to the battle frenzy, and head to the wild north for greater battles. These dwarves become known as the Vanished, and it is said to meet one is quite dangerous, as they no longer see friend or foe but merely victims for their axes. Although most dwarves prefer the deep dark of their underground homes, some feel a calling for the wilds of the surface. Usually young, these dwarves feel a deep kinship with nature, and wish to hunt in its forests and discover its mysteries. Eventually receiving the title of Ranger, they become expert scouts and pathfinders, as well as mastering ambushes and flank marches. A few even have an affinity with animals, and take on the task of raising livestock for the hold. Other dwarves occasionally make fun of these rangers for their undwarven-like behavior, until the rangers unleash their purebred war dogs on the insulting dwarf's unfortunate ankles. Although all races are technically capable of wielding magic, the structure of the dwarven mind makes such grasping of the chaotic nature of sorcery extremely difficult. Not to mention the fact that dwarves find anything that isn't easily quantifiable or reliable as something to distrust, which is why they tend to focus on the sciences of engineering and loud guns. However, a few dwarves are born with an affinity with a certain type of magic. Mesmerized by rocks or gems in ways that makes other dwarves uncomfortable, they soon realize they can feel the stone around them like it's a living, breathing thing, a state of mind called stonewise. Eventually, the organization known as the Order of Stone grabs these young dwarves and teaches them the way of stone, turning these stone-touched into stone priests. Wielding the magic of the earth and becoming capable of summoning powerful stone elementals, they are essentially a living echo of the mystical origins of the dwarven race. And although most dwarves are generally distrustful of anything to do with magic, they have learned to respect the usefulness of these magical dwarves. Each dwarf hold is ruled by a noble lord, a dwarf that can trace his lineage to a time before the Age of Light. They are encased in the finest rune-etched arms and armor, and are protected by the Iron Guard, hand-picked veterans who are sworn protectors of their noble lord. Now that we have an understanding of the dwarven race, we can finally explore their history. Now, most of the history of the dwarves during the Time of Light is unknown. Who knows how many great underground empires had risen and fallen, how many great evils they had faced or great monsters they may have destroyed in those depths. The dwarves keep such information to themselves, if they remember at all, and although there were a few skirmishes and a splattering of diplomatic meetings, they only truly became part of common history during the God War. During that cataclysmic conflict, the dwarves were pushed from fighting in the cramped corridors they were used to the open surface, and while other races might have stumbled with the change, the dwarves excelled, quickly forming the tight gun lines and vast blocks of infantry they are known for. After the war, their trust in outsiders, especially the elves, only shrank. However, their urge to explore only grew as many dwarves wished to explore other mountains beyond their home. Some went to the Hapley Mountains, forming the northern holds that we know today. Others, despite warnings from the warsmiths, moved to the mountains around the Abyss, their greed leading them to become corrupted by the abyssal energies, and turning them into the abyssal dwarves. The southern and northern dwarves, although slowly differing from each other, were still one people, ruled by a king who, at least on stone, commanded all the dwarven holds. That was until the war with Winter, when that particular wicked god threatened the world. The king at the time chose to honor old oaths and help the other races fight against this evil goddess. The northern dwarves, rich, powerful, and secure in their holds, refused to follow their king's orders, believing they should look to their own. The High King, unable to risk a division at so crucial a time, simply went to war with the forces of the southern holds, and it was a disaster. Most of the dwarven fighters were wiped out, and the High King and his heirs were killed, leaving no clear line of succession. As for the north, they weren't free from the machinations of the wicked goddess as waves of orcs and goblins assaulted their home. Although they succeeded in their defense, dozens of holds fell, leaving only 5. The rich northern holds a shell of its former self. Since then, both sides blamed each other for their losses. The southern dwarves call the north Oathbreakers, and say that if the north had joined the war, they would not have lost their king and so many of their kin. The northern dwarves call the south Betrayers, and say that if the southern dwarves had stayed away from the affairs of other races, they could have helped their dwarven brothers and sisters in the defense of their northern home. The North swore they would never follow the decree of a High King again, forming a council of clans known as the Free Clans, although many outside of the holds know them as the Free Dwarves. I will discuss them more in a future class. As for the South, they suffered for centuries under the ever-changing reign of weak kings. That was the state of things, until the crowning of Golic. Golic was a lord who had a legitimate claim to the throne, and could have fought for it in a direct way of the dwarves, perhaps a debate on his merits or maybe an honor duel or two. However, he chose to fight for his claim in a manner that other dwarves would call mannish, using the most vile of human creations, politics. As other nobles fought for the throne, Golic bided his time. He slowly started incorporating the sundered clans, whose nobles died during the war with Winter, into his own, giving him a surplus of loyal, orphaned wards to put under his banner, and marriageable age women to use for favorable arranged marriages with other stronger clans. He also used his vast wealth to pay off the debts of other clans who had never financially recovered from that devastating conflict. Those dwarves who saw his behavior and the danger it represented could do nothing, as most of the disunited clans were more worried about their own internal problems than the vague threat of an ambitious dwarf. That was until Golic declared his clan hold was now the new seat of power, renaming it Karin Golic, and made himself High King. When he demanded loyalty from old dwarves, most clans refused, and Golic, once showing his subtlety in the form of politics, now showed his ruthlessness in the form of war. When the dust settled, the southern holds were firmly in his control, and those nobles who didn't bend the knee or were killed fled to the safety of the northern free clans. Golic's territorial ambitions is not limited to the southern dwarves, or even the eventual conquest of the northern holds, but also many of the human kingdoms across his borders. Already several human villages are his vassals, and the bordering kingdom of Basilia is looking upon this dwarven High King's mountain nation with worry. Well students, I hope that was a helpful guide on what some would call the most stubborn of the races. When we return, we will speak of a race who are in many ways their polar opposite. I am of course speaking of the elves. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on the dwarves in the Kings of War universe. If you like it, please like, subscribe, comment, press that little bell, you know the drill. But if you really like it and you're inclined, please send a little money my way through my Patreon or Ko-fi account. The extra money gives me the time I need to work on these stories I love. Anyway, thanks for listening/watching, and see you next time.